Well, this is Fresh Air, and you're listening to WUHY-FM in Philadelphia. 3 minutes after 4 is the time. Have you seen the film The Buddy Holly Story yet? If you haven't seen it, you've probably heard about it. The director of the film, Steve Rash, is in the studio with me now. Before we meet Steve Rash, we're going to listen to some music. Buddy Holly recorded between 1957 and 59. He was killed in a plane crash in 59. His first record, released with the Crickets in 1957, was That'll Be the Day, which Holly wrote. The song spotlighted the qualities he quickly became known for, a rough, hiccuping style of singing, heavily amplified guitar, and a rough, unpolished beat. This is how it sounded, Buddy Holly's first record, That'll Be the Day. That'll Be the Day, Buddy Holly's first record. Holly's music influenced many American and British rock groups. People are still recording his songs. Linda Ronstadt featured That'll Be the Day on a recent album, which ended up getting a lot of radio play. The British rock group called the Hollies paid tribute to Holly with the use of his name, and it said that the Beatles called themselves the Beatles as a kind of wordplay on the Crickets. Well, the Beatles did record Holly's song Words of Love. Words of Love shows another side of Holly, the softer ballad side. This was recorded before the softer side of his recording career was embellished in the production process with strings and MOR arrangements. We'll hear Buddy Holly's recording of his own Words of Love and follow it with the Beatles' recording of the same. You can hear that the Beatles probably spent a lot of time listening to Holly. We're going to hear a track next from the soundtrack album of the film The Buddy Holly Story, and you'll hear that the people who made the film also spent a lot of time listening to Holly. Gary Busey, who plays Buddy Holly in the film, sings lead. Don Stroud, who plays the percussionist Cricket, is on percussion. Charles Martin Smith, who plays the bass-playing Cricket, is on bass. It's an unusual touch that the actors actually play their own stuff for the film. We'll hear some of the music featured in the opening segment of the film. Buddy Holly and the Crickets are playing at a roller rink. The music is being broadcast live on the local station there in Texas. They're supposed to be playing country hits. After singing something by Les Paul and Mary Ford, Holly insists that they do one of their own rock and roll tunes. With these next tunes, Rock Around with Ollie V and That'll Be the Day, they electrify the roller rink audience but lose sponsors for the radio show. This is how they do it in the film. That was Gary Busey as Buddy Holly from the soundtrack recording of the film The Buddy Holly Story. The director of the film, Steve Rash, is with me in the studio now. This was his first feature-length film, but it was not his first encounter with placing rock and roll into a visual medium. He co-produced a 96-part rock music series for CBS. It was called Music Connection. At his first television job in Atlanta, he produced a local rock program. Steve himself was a music student before switching to film. The Buddy Holly Story breaks a lot of rules. There are no already very famous stars to attract box office. The budget is a very low $2 million. The film was produced independently. The actors who played the role of musicians also played their own instruments and sang, and it looks like the film is going to be a commercial and a critical success. Steve Rash, welcome to Fresh Air. Really glad you could make it.
It's nice to be here.
I think maybe that I didn't mention that one of the rules that you've kind of broken is that you live neither in Los Angeles nor in New York, the entertainment capitals, but you live in the Philadelphia area in Wynmore. Well, let me start by asking you why, of all your choices of films to be your first film to direct, since you were working on this independently, you narrowed it down to a Buddy Holly biography.
Well, I always wanted to do a rock and roll film. Or a rock film, something in that vein. And I thought that to kill two birds with one stone, I wanted to give the people in this country a greater understanding of where their musical roots came from. And I felt that other than Elvis, the only other major force in white rock and roll was Buddy Holly. And I felt that Buddy had been lost in this country's consciousness for a variety of reasons, and only the British really respected Buddy for being what he was, basically the father of white rock and roll.
Now, when you're looking at somebody, a person who really lived to be the subject of a film, I would guess that you have to see also how dramatic and possibly filmic their lives were, as well as how influential they were in the history of rock and roll.
Right. Buddy's story is, in many respects, the same story as the Glenn Miller story, a person who had a sound in his head, who wanted to do things differently, and who fought for what he heard and eventually triumphed and made a great contribution to our culture here. And then fate snuffed their lives out in pretty much the same way. So it had those components of what has traditionally been known as good drama. And many of the other rock and rollers who deserved to have their stories told had less attractive ends to their lives. Morrison and Joplin and those people.
Like junk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. There are some difficulties in a biographical film that you don't have when you're creating everything from your own fantasy.
Absolutely.
For instance, you have to get people's permission to dramatize their own lives. Who did you have to go to and get formal permission from before you could even consider making the Buddy Holly story?
From his estate, which meant his widow and also his parents.
How cooperative were they?
Well, Maria, his widow, had been approached a number of times, 6 or 8 times at various points, to do Buddy's story, mostly by major studios or a couple of television networks, tried to get things going. And she always got bad vibes. She always felt that they were more interested in exploiting Buddy Holly's name value than they were in telling a story. So when push came to shove, she always declined. And Freddie Bauer, who is another Philadelphian, and I, when we got this idea to do this movie, the first thing we did was get in the car and drive down to Miami, where we found out that his widow lived. And we went to talk to her, and we told her what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. And basically she had a gut reaction that we would be the most likely to do a sincere job of telling the story, and that it was more important to us than just another film. It was our very lives and our futures were wrapped up in this, and we'd better succeed, or the consequences would be much worse for us than they would be for some studio who had 100 other films on the books.
Because basically your whole career was at stake here.
Everything.
Did they ever try to convince you, before you even really embarked on the details of the film, before the script was really written, that they should come off looking a certain way?
No.
Either the parents or Maria Elena?
No. We explained in this concept of how we wanted to do the film, we said the most important thing is that one consciousness keeps control of the project from beginning to end, or it will get lost in someone else's concept or conflicting concepts. And we said, you'll just have to trust us that in the balance, we will do what's fair to Buddy.
What do you have to do to get other people who really existed to get rights to the use of their name and their story within the film, characters that are, maybe more peripheral to his life, but nevertheless are based on real people?
Well, the legalisms are very complex. One school of thought says that if you were in close association professionally with a dead person who was in the public eye, then in that context you cannot prevent someone telling your association with a famous person. There's another school of legalism that says get a piece of paper anyway.
Right.
So.
But if you're using someone's name, do you have to buy the right to use their name?
Yeah. You don't have to, but it makes it so much more complicated if you don't.
Someone who is kind of conspicuously absent from the film is Norm Petty, who was Buddy Holly's producer and who was frequently given songwriting credits on a lot of Holly's hits. Right. He's not in the film. Holly has no producer. He's his own producer, the way the story is told within the film. What's the story there? Did you approach Norm Petty, his producer, and ask for permission to use his name and
Yes, we
person?
did. Norman wanted script approval, basically. And since we hadn't given it to the estate, and we had decided not to give it to a major studio, then we shouldn't give it to anyone. So it boils down to we couldn't make a deal.
So suddenly someone who was a part of Holly's career is absent.
Yeah, there are others too.
Uh-huh.
There are in the course of anyone's professional life, even if it's a short one, there are a lot of characters who contribute. And in most cases, the characters are condensed for brevity's sake into one figure that represents more than one person. For example, there were 3 or 4 disc jockeys in Lubbock that believed in Buddy and believed in his music and gave him help along the way. But again, for the sake of brevity, we condensed those down into one character who encompasses that contribution of all of them.
Getting back to Petty again, the way the story is told within the film, Buddy Holly is walking around with a sound in his head, and he produces his own records. He basically does his own arrangements and becomes an auteur of rock and roll, which was, to my understanding, not really heard of in those days.
That's right.
It's kind of with the Beatles that you have singer, songwriter, arranger, producer all rolled into one starting to occur.
There were others. Les Paul,
right,
in particular, was very much an auteur of his music.
Well, so that's, I guess, at least mildly fictionalized, that Holly is an auteur.
It is simplified. It's not much of an overstatement. From all accounts that I've been able to get, it was always Buddy's sound, and there were a lot of people that helped him get it, helped him write down the notes so that other people, the strings, for example, could play those sounds. And there were engineers and producers who helped Buddy, especially in the early days, get it on tape, go through the technical process of recording it. And in summation, especially in the last year of Buddy's life, he was pretty much doing it all. And from all accounts, his idea of where he was going was more into the production area than the performing area. He saw his life as a performer being a very short one, but moving on into producing other people. As a matter of fact, he produced Waylon Jennings' first record, and had plans at the time of his death to produce a lot of other artists, Ray Charles, and he was going to branch out into a lot of different areas. As you can see by his latter music, he was already dipping into what you could call the MOR type of arrangements, sweeter. So he was going in a lot of different directions.
There are people like me in the audience for your film who, as soon as it's over, run to their books about rock and roll and look up Holly in the index and try to see how much of the film is, absolutely real, based on fact, and how much of it is fictionalized. As the filmmaker here, as the director of the film, is that a response that you'd kind of like to have? Would you like to would it make you happy if a lot of people started running to rock and roll books and going back to
sure.
Buddy Holly records?
It's about time. That's one of the main reasons for making the film, is that nobody knows who Buddy Holly is, and hopefully this film will tell them.
How comfortable are you, though, with nitpicking? I have a list here of sequences that I wasn't sure if they really occurred or not. Maybe we'll go over them later.
I'm not sensitive at all.
As far as the accuracy, I mean, how you said that you distilled, say, 3 people into one for the purposes of brevity and of dramatic device, I guess.
Right.
But that leaves a somewhat misrepresented sense, though. I guess you could say that the
the only way to do a totally accurate story would be for it to be 2.5 years long. Then you would be 100% accurate. Anything less than real time is an inaccuracy by and of itself. So anytime you're limited to 2 hours or less, then it's grossly inaccurate, especially from a temporal standpoint. But that's what movies are, is condensing time and space. You don't want to do a movie that moves as slow as life really moves, or nobody would be interested.
Did you go back to other biographical films that were done and get a sense of how other directors had handled?
No, not really. I thought that this wouldn't benefit from the old construction. As it turned out, the structure is very close to, for example, the Glenn Miller story. In other words, it's in continuity. It doesn't jump around with flashbacks and so forth. It's very straightforward construction, and I think that's because both situations demanded the same kind of structure.
The feeling for the 1950s that's in your film struck me when I was seeing it as being very, very well done, with a really terrific eye for details, and not overstated and made ridiculous like some other movies and TV shows about the 50s that are available for viewing now. Can you talk a little bit about like what perspective you used to portray the 1950s? Where were you?
Well, one thing we wanted for sure is that we did not want a 50s movie where the 50s is a driving part of the film. Rather, we wanted to make a movie that just happened to be in the 50s. And we wanted to take the audience back to the 50s and try to keep from snapping them back to the present. And every time you're tempted to point up some juicy little remembrance from the past, if you yield to that temptation and look at it with a little bit of cynicism from today, then bang, the audience is back for that moment in today's perspective. When we tried to look at everything that was in the 50s from the 50s point of view rather than from the 70s point of view.
I think that's really very important, and I think it really worked in the film.
It's a subtlety that's a lot stronger than you would imagine, I think, going in.
Well, I think you're right, that a film gives itself away. Like, you can see films made in the 60s about the 40s, for instance. You could tell it was made in the 60s because the clothes look like 60s renditions of what people wore in the 40s, and it's really a giveaway, and the film looks really dated.
Yeah. But the minute you take a close-up of a poodle skirt, then you're saying to the audience, hey, look, we're in the 50s. And all of a sudden, for that instant, they're no longer concerned with the story as it's happening.
I mean, because like if you shot it in the 1950s, you wouldn't have to give a close-up on the skirt because you'd know it was the 1950s. Yeah. That's lovely. So, who did you like find someone, for instance, to like be the costume designer, to dress everybody just so?
Yeah. The overall art director has done fabulous work. Rosemary's Baby, in particular, beautiful art direction. The Reavers, and several other fine films. And he was able to stick to his guns and do it with subtlety and taste and resist the temptations to really garish things up, to try to, oversell the 50s. And that same concept carried down through the props, wardrobe, hair, and everything. Let's play it cool and let's don't get all excited about the 50s.